Imagine stepping back to the late 1490s, a time when kings were struggling to forge modern nations from the fragments of the medieval world. In the cold waters of the Baltic Sea, a ship appeared that was more than just wood and sail. It was a floating declaration of power, a technological marvel, and a symbol of royal ambition. This was Gribshunden, the Griffinhound, the flagship of King Hans of Denmark. King Hans ruled over the Kalmar Union, a fragile alliance of Scandinavian kingdoms. Sweden, however, was restless, its nobles suspicious of Danish authority. To Hans, power wasn't something to be debated in dusty halls. It had to be seen, felt, and feared. Gribshunden was the embodiment of that belief. Its name alone suggested a fierce creature, loyal and deadly. Along its sides, a series of dark circles hinted at a revolution in naval warfare. Heavy cannons, at a time when artillery was still mostly for castles and land battles. Putting such firepower on a maneuverable ship was a game-changer. It turned a vessel into a mobile fortress, allowing the king to project his might wherever the water reached. Life aboard Gribshunden was a world unto itself. The air smelled of salt, tar, and gunpowder. It was a strict hierarchy, with officers overseeing sailors, carpenters, and specialized gunners. Everyone knew their role, bound by discipline and the shared understanding that a single mistake could mean disaster at sea. The ship was on a mission that was both diplomatic and military. King Hans was sailing to meet Swedish leaders, not as a negotiator, but as their rightful sovereign, arriving with a force that simply couldn't be ignored. The journey began as a display of strength. Gribshunden moved through the familiar trade routes of the Baltic, a sea that was both a highway for commerce and a stage for conflict. Smaller vessels would have given it a wide berth. From fishing boats and coastal towns, people would have watched this floating castle pass, whispering about the king's power. It was a clear message. Denmark's reach extended far beyond its shores. The ship sailed toward the coast of modern-day Sweden, near the town of Ronneby, which was then Danish territory. The stage was set for a grand political statement. But then, without any warning, the unthinkable happened. Later accounts would speak of a sudden, catastrophic explosion. We'll never know for sure if it was a stray spark finding loose gunpowder, a careless accident, or even sabotage, but the result was absolute devastation. Fire tore through the wooden vessel, feasting on tarred ropes and timbers. The ship's mighty cannons, once its greatest strength, became instruments of its destruction, tearing through the hull as the heat warped their mounts. On deck, discipline evaporated into pure survival instinct. Panic spread faster than the flames. Men jumped into the cold sea, some dragged under by the weight of their own armor. Others were trapped below, in passages now choked with smoke and fire. From the shore, what was once a symbol of royal authority became a pillar of black smoke. The Griffinhound, the ship built to project ultimate control, was now utterly consumed by chaos. It broke apart and sank into the shallow waters, its great voyage ending in fire and silence. For King Hans, this was a disaster that went far beyond the loss of a ship. It was a public humiliation. The very tool he had used to broadcast his strength now broadcast his vulnerability for all his rivals and allies to see. In the immediate aftermath, the priority was to contain the damage, both physically and politically. Salvage crews tried to recover what they could: valuable cannons, weapons, anything that could be reused or hidden from enemies. But much was left behind, sinking into the mud and silt. The Baltic Sea, with its cold, brackish water, became an unwilling guardian. It preserved the wreck in near-perfect anaerobic darkness, sealing a moment in time. King Hans, though diminished, pressed on with his mission, his ambitions delayed but not defeated. For nearly 500 years, Gribshunden rested on the seafloor, a forgotten secret. Fishermen would snag their nets on an unseen obstacle, cursing their bad luck, never knowing they were touching a royal past. The ship faded from memory, its story surviving only in a few obscure documents. It became a ghost, a legend whispered among historians. The wreck itself, however, was more than just a sunken ship. It was a time capsule from a pivotal moment in history, the dawn of the modern era. Gribshunden represented the transition from medieval to early modern warfare, the rise of centralized royal power, and the daring experiments with new technology. Its destruction was a stark reminder that innovation always carries risk. Then, in the 1970s, sports divers stumbled upon the wreck site. But it wasn't until decades later that archaeologists realized the true identity of what they had found. The dark, cold waters of the Baltic had preserved Gribshunden in astonishing condition. When marine archaeologists began to explore the wreckage, they weren't just finding old wood and rusty metal, they were uncovering a snapshot of late 15th century life and technology. One of the most remarkable discoveries was the figurehead, a terrifying, dragon-like sea monster, carved from a single piece of wood. It was designed to intimidate enemies and proclaim the king's ferocity. Imagine seeing that beast looming out of the sea mist. The figurehead is one of the only preserved examples of its kind from this period, offering a direct glimpse into the symbolism and psychology of the age. But the discoveries went deeper. Archaeologists found everyday objects that brought the ship's crew to life: wooden tankards for drinking, leather shoes, coins, and even barrels of food. Among the more surprising finds were spices like saffron and peppercorns, luxury goods that showed this was no ordinary military vessel. It was a royal court on the water, equipped to host and impress. They also found the ship's arsenal: crossbows, handguns, and the remnants of those revolutionary heavy cannons confirmed its role as a state-of-the-art war machine. Each artifact tells a part of the story, from the strategic ambitions of a king to the daily life of a common sailor. The excavation of Gribshunden is like solving a 500-year-old mystery. It challenges what we thought we knew about this era of exploration and conflict, often called the Age of Discovery. While Columbus was sailing west, King Hans was consolidating power in the north, using similar advancements in shipbuilding and weaponry. Gribshunden shows us that history wasn't just happening in one part of the world, it was a global wave of change. The ship's story is a powerful lesson in how ambition and technology can collide with the unpredictable forces of nature and chance. It's a tale of power, disaster, and ultimately, rediscovery. The Griffinhound may have met a fiery end, but by sinking into the Baltic's protective embrace, it preserved its secrets for us. Today, as archaeologists continue to bring its story to the surface, Gribshunden sails again, not as a ship of war, but as a vessel of knowledge, carrying its final, most valuable cargo from the past into the future. When the Danish royal warship Gribshunden caught fire and sank in 1495, it was more than just a military disaster. It was a moment frozen in time. For over 500 years, the wreck lay silent on the seabed off the coast of Sweden. But when archaeologists finally began to explore its preserved timbers, they uncovered a story far more complex than that of a simple warship. The cargo of the Gribshunden reveals a murky world, where the lines between a king's authority and a pirate's tactics were almost indistinguishable. This wasn't just a ship stocked for battle. It was a floating stage for power, diplomacy, and intimidation, equipped with the very tools and strategies that rulers publicly condemned in others. Let's start with the most obvious finds: the weapons. Heavy bronze cannons, some still loaded after half a millennium, lay scattered across the debris field. In the late 15th century, ship-mounted cannons were a terrifying novelty, a powerful symbol of royal might. But where did this idea come from? For years, pirates had been the masters of using artillery at sea to cripple merchant ships from a distance, avoiding the risk of boarding. Kings, it seems, were paying attention. They adopted the pirate's logic, refined it, and stamped it with a royal seal. On the Gribshunden, these guns weren't just for sinking enemy ships. They were an argument cast in metal, a tool of persuasion designed to make anyone think twice before challenging the crown. Alongside the cannons, divers found a collection of personal arm swords, daggers, and crossbows. What's fascinating is the variety. Some were clearly high-quality, custom-made pieces fit for a king's guard. Others were rough, well-used weapons of mismatched styles. This mix suggests that the royal arsenal wasn't just supplied by official foundries. It was drawing from the same open market that armed mercenaries, privateers, and yes, pirates. In this era, a weapon was a weapon. The steel didn't care whose hand held it. The only thing that decided whether an act of violence was called justice or crime was who came out on top. But the Gribshunden carried more than just weapons. Dozens of barrels were found, and while many contained food for the large crew and royal entourage, salted fish, meat, and grain, chemical analysis of the residue told a different story. Scientists found traces of sulfur and other key ingredients for gunpowder. The ship was carrying these components in bulk, far more than needed for a single engagement. This points to a plan for a prolonged campaign of intimidation, a floating fortress ready to project power over an extended period. It's the exact same logistical strategy a pirate captain would use, stockpiling supplies captured from other ships to stay at sea for months, far from any friendly port. The king's ship was essentially operating with a pirate's playbook. Then there were the locked chests. Though their contents had mostly decayed, the context and fragments left behind paint a clear picture. These chests likely held the king's diplomatic tools, luxurious textiles, fine metalwork, and specially minted coins. In the world of medieval politics, a good gift could be more powerful than a good sword. These offerings were designed to flatter powerful nobles and secure their loyalty to the Danish crown. But think about it, the difference between a king's diplomatic gift and a pirate's treasure chest. Both are filled with portable, high-value wealth used to buy influence and power. The only real distinction was the paperwork. The king's acquisitions were recorded in royal ledgers as taxes or tribute. The pirates were simply taken by force. The objects themselves, however, were often identical. So, what we see in the Gribshunden is a hybrid vessel. It was simultaneously a warship, a diplomatic embassy, and a floating treasury. This wasn't an accident. It was a reflection of the brutal realities of the time. King Hans of Denmark was operating in a world where powerful merchant groups, like the Hanseatic League, controlled the seas and the wealth that flowed through them. To be a successful ruler, you had to control the sea lanes. And that's exactly what pirates did. They disrupted trade and extracted wealth. Kings sought to do the same, but they called it taxing and protection. The evidence suggests that the very same sailors often worked on both sides of the law. A mariner might serve on a royal warship one season and then join a pirate crew the next, depending on who was paying better or where the opportunity lay. The crew that stocked the Gribshunden knew the sea. They knew what it took to survive, what impressed allies, and what terrified enemies. They understood that the line between state-sanctioned force and outright piracy wasn't just thin. It was flexible and often negotiable. Even the way a ship like Gribshunden was funded blurs the lines. Outfitting a state-of-the-art warship was incredibly expensive. Taxes alone were never enough. Rulers relied on loans from wealthy merchants. They confiscated property from their enemies under the color of law. And sometimes, they just seized what they needed and called it political necessity. When you break it down, the methods weren't so different. Pirates took by force. Kings took by decree. Both used the threat of violence to achieve their goals. And the cargo of the Gribshunden, gathered through all these channels, embodies that shared logic. Even the most mundane objects on the ship tell this story. The cooking pots, the tools, the spare rigging, their quality and quantity suggest this was no ordinary voyage. This was a mobile operational base, designed to sustain itself for long periods and project an image of unshakable stability. Again, this mirrors the strategy of successful pirate fleets, which prioritized endurance above all else. The ability to remain at sea meant you could outlast your enemies and evade capture. King Hans's flagship was built on this very same principle, just adapted for royal purposes. And what about the most powerful cargo of all? Information. The documents, letters, and messengers went up in flames. The ship's entire mission depended on them. In the 15th century, controlling information was just as important as controlling the seas. And here, once again, princes and pirates operated in surprisingly similar ways. Formal reports from official channels were one thing, but the real prizes were intelligence gathered from bribed dockworkers, coerced sea captains, and a network of spies and informants. A royal ship arriving in a port armed with inside knowledge of local politics and merchant schedules had a massive advantage, the same kind of advantage a pirate raider used to pick the most vulnerable and profitable targets. As archaeologists mapped the wreck, they noticed something striking. The way the ship was organized, where the weapons were stored for quick access, how the valuable cargo was secured, all mirrored the practical, efficient layout seen in pirate ships from later eras. On the open sea, ceremony takes a back seat to survival. Everything had to be functional, defensible, and ready to go at a moment's notice. The Gribshunden was a royal vessel, but it was designed by people who understood the ruthless logic of the sea. The great irony is that this mighty ship didn't sink in a blaze of glory during a heroic battle. It sank while at anchor, during the formal, ceremonial part of its mission. Its immense cargo of power and persuasion was never actually used, but in its failure, it did something remarkable. It preserved a perfect snapshot of a world that preferred to keep its moral lines blurry. The king who publicly condemned piracy was secretly using its methods. The pirates who defied kings were, in their own way, borrowing the symbols and strategies of royal power. The flags might have been different, but the tactics were often the same. By resting on the seabed for 5 centuries, the Gribshunden escaped the biased histories written by the victors. It couldn't be spun into a tale of glorious triumph or tragic but noble loss. Instead, it waited to testify, not through words, but through objects. Each cannon, each sword, each barrel complicates the clean-cut story we're often told. It insists that maritime power in the late medieval world was not a simple matter of good versus evil, law versus chaos. Commerce, diplomacy, and violence were all tangled together, and ships like the Gribshunden were the knots that held the whole system in place. Ultimately, the wreck reveals a truth that is perhaps a little unsettling. It forces us to ask, what really was the difference between a pirate and a king? If both used violence, intimidation, and strategic plunder to achieve their goals, was the distinction just a matter of scale, of legitimacy, of who got to write the history books? The Gribshunden doesn't offer a simple answer. It just shows us the evidence, laid bare on the ocean floor. It reveals that the difference between the pirate and the king was often just a matter of who you recognized as being in charge, not how they behaved. Deep beneath the cold waters of the Baltic Sea lies a secret. For over 500 years, the shipwreck Gribshunden has held its story. A story that blurs the lines we thought were so clear. When we think of the past, we like neat categories: pirate, privateer, royal servant. But the more we examine Gribshunden, the more those categories fall apart. This ship, a royal flagship of the Danish king, reveals a world where the sea itself respected no boundaries, and authority was as fluid as the water it sailed on. In the late 15th century, who was in charge? Well, that often depended on who survived to write the history. The Gribshunden wreck doesn't show us an exception to the rule. It shows us the system itself. Kings like Hans of Denmark didn't just tolerate piracy on the edges of their kingdoms. They adopted its very logic. Think about it. Violence at sea was expensive, it was risky, and it was politically messy. Sailors were given vague permissions to harass enemies, which was basically a license to plunder as long as they hit the right targets. If they stepped over an invisible line, they were suddenly branded as criminals, their royal service conveniently forgotten. The king's hands stayed clean, because the sea, as they say, erases fingerprints. Gribshunden fits perfectly into this moral gray zone. It was heavily armed, it was carrying mobile wealth, and it was on an intelligence-gathering mission. Sound familiar? That's almost the exact operational profile of a successful pirate ship. The only real difference was the flag. Pirates flew no recognized banner, while Gribshunden carried a royal emblem, but their methods were identical. Both relied on shock, speed, and the terrifying threat of overwhelming force. Both aimed to control trade not by nurturing it, but by making any disobedience far too costly. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was pure pragmatism. The Baltic back then was a crowded, competitive arena. Merchant convoys moved timber, grain, and iron, the very resources that entire economies were built on. To dominate this region, a king needed more than just laws on paper. He needed a physical presence. Ships like Gribshunden were not just tools of war, they were instruments of regulation. They enforced tolls, intimidated rivals, and served as a constant reminder of which authority demanded obedience that day. But here's the thing. Pirates did the exact same thing for themselves, creating their own temporary zones of control where their rules applied. The wreck also forces us to rethink what we mean by responsibility. When Gribshunden exploded and sank, it wasn't because of an enemy attack or some heroic last stand. It was a failure born from the very tools and practices meant to ensure its dominance. Storing huge quantities of gunpowder, crowding the decks with weapons and valuables, pushing the crew to operate under constant high alert. These were the risks pirates willingly accepted as the price of their freedom. A king's ship adopted the same dangerous practices in the name of order, and ultimately paid the same price when something went horribly wrong. In a way, the loss of the ship is symbolic. The sea didn't care if the violence was state-sanctioned or not. It punished excess equally. For every pirate ship that went down in a storm or a fire, a royal vessel could, and did, meet the same fate. The only difference was in how they were remembered. Pirates disappeared into cautionary tales or criminal records. Royal losses were reframed as necessary risks of governing. But Gribshunden, hidden and silent for centuries, escaped both of these narratives. As archaeologists now piece together its story, a much more honest picture of power is emerging. Authority wasn't a fixed, solid thing. It was a performance, renewed every single day through displays of force and control. And when that performance failed, when a ship burned before it could fulfill its mission, the whole illusion cracked. Gribshunden's remains show a monarchy that was experimenting, borrowing, and improvising. It wasn't standing apart from the violence of the sea. It was right in the middle of it, deeply embedded within it. This completely changes how we should view the history of piracy. Instead of seeing piracy as some fringe activity, we should see it as a spectrum of maritime work. Its crew likely included men who had raided illegally before and would do so again if the opportunity arose. Loyalty was often temporary, tied to pay and survival, not grand ideology. The ship's fate also helps explain why piracy was so persistent. When rulers adopted pirate methods, they essentially validated them. Every time a king sanctioned plunder but called it something else, it just reinforced the idea that force at sea was a legitimate way to get rich. Campaigns to suppress piracy must have seemed ridiculous to merchants who knew that yesterday's most wanted pirate could easily be tomorrow's royal captain. Gribshunden's cargo perfectly embodies this contradiction. It was half arsenal, half treasure chest. There's an uncomfortable symmetry here. Pirates were condemned for destabilizing trade, but they thrived in environments that were already destabilized by constant royal conflicts. Kings blamed piracy for economic problems, while their own wars created the very conditions that pirates exploited. Gribshunden was sent to stabilize the king's authority, but its very presence on the water signaled tension and threat. To the local communities and other sailors, a heavily armed royal warship could be just as frightening as any outlaw vessel. By sinking Gribshunden, inadvertently democratized its own legacy. The disaster stripped away all the intentions, all the politics, and left only the hard evidence. Without the proclamations or the excuses, the artifacts speak for themselves. They show a state willing to arm itself like a pirate, to move wealth like a raider, and to command the sea through fear just as much as through law. The wreck suggests that the difference between a pirate and a king wasn't in their methods, but in their outcomes and, crucially, in who got to control the story afterward. This is why Gribshunden is so important today. It challenges our comfortable view of the past, where we assume authority is orderly and piracy is just an aberration. Instead, it reveals a maritime world governed by negotiation, opportunism, and violence that flowed freely across legal lines. The ship wasn't doomed because it strayed from royal norms. It was doomed because it embodied them too perfectly. As its timbers continue to yield their secrets, Gribshunden is doing more than just illuminating a single 500-year-old disaster. It's forcing us to reckon with how power was actually built on the water, unstable, lethal, and improvisational. The sea didn't care who claimed to own it. Those who sailed it, whether they were crowned kings or condemned criminals, learned the same harsh lessons in fire and salt. The wreck doesn't accuse King Hans of being a pirate, nor does it romanticize pirates as heroes. It simply collapses the distance between them. In the Baltic of the late Middle Ages, authority floated on gunpowder and courage, and legitimacy was often just a matter of surviving long enough to be believed. Gribshunden failed to survive, but in its failure, it tells the truth with a clarity no historical chronicle ever could.